This is a conversation with Ray Johnson and Laury Rappaport. Hi, Ray. Hi, Laury.
Hi, Ray.
Hi, Serge.
And Serge.
So, a few months ago, we started talking about having this conversation about the poetic body. And maybe you want to just talk a little bit about how that came about.
Sure, I'll start. Because, in fact, the idea of having conversations around this topic came originally from some work that I was doing with Meridian University in the North Bay area in California, because Meridian is in the process of developing a somatic psychology concentration and also had a history of drawing on the expressive arts in their graduate programs in psychology. And so together with the folks at Meridian, I helped put together and host a symposium called The Poetic Body, with the idea that there was some real shared territory between somatic psychologists and expressive arts therapists, in that as practitioners, we all work with a territory in the human experience and the human psyche that has to do with things that are implicit, not very clear, and often more easily elicited through creative process than anything else. And I guess I also at this point want to acknowledge the fact that I borrowed this term, the poetic body, for the symposium from something that Thomas More wrote in Care of the Soul. And although he didn't say very much about it, the idea of the body as something that wasn't an object, but rather a very alive and creatively oriented subject was intriguing to me. So that's how I got to choose the poetic body as the title for this symposium. And Laury was one of the presenters that we invited to speak at the symposium because of her background both as a focusing practitioner and trainer as well as an art therapist. So she really brought both of those elements to the conversation.
Yeah. Laury, do you want to say a little something about that experience or what it meant to you?
Yeah, I was really excited when I got invited to be part of this symposium on a panel. And when I first received the invitation, I was like, oh wow, they invited me to be on the somatic psychology panel. And I hadn't really identified myself in the somatic psychology arena. And it kind of woke me up to the fact that, oh yes, actually, that is what I have been doing for over 30
You're one of us, Laury.
Yeah, for over 30 years. And yeah, because I've been a focusing trainer. I learned focusing over 30 years ago at the same time that I was studying expressive arts therapy at Leicester University. And when I was learning focusing at the same time that I was in the expressive arts program, I was like, when I would focus, I would say, oh my goodness, this is so familiar. And there was a sense that this is what happens when I'm engaged in the expressive arts. And the thing is, though, that the focusing added a heightened awareness, a more conscious awareness to everything that was happening on the somatic level. And it added a mindfulness component. So I was so excited that I was invited, and it was just an incredible symposium because there was this very rich interchange of, people who had been doing somatic work for so long. And then it was really a very new beginning conversation to begin the integration or the crossing of the arts with somatics.
Yeah. So we're at this crossing, at this intersection, where there's something happening where the body is not an object, and there's something happening that we cannot really put into explicit language, but at an implicit level. That's what both of you are talking about.
Right.
So how can we maybe give a little bit of sense of that experience to people? Maybe not necessarily talking about it, but some examples, or what would give a sense of that experience to people?
Well, if it's all right, maybe I'll just share a little bit from my own both personal and clinical experience to provide some illustrations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
On a personal level, what drew me to become a somatic psychotherapist, as well as someone who very strongly draws on the arts, both in my own life and in my practice, is the fact that I think in a way that's maybe very similar to what Laury has just described, I recognized a similar experience, both when I was deeply connected to my embodied self, that is, when I was really in sensation and embodied awareness, and when I was engaged in art. That there was something about both of those experiences that made me feel alive, awake, richly resourced with sensation and inspiration and imagery. And I put the two fields together just because for me, they had this shared experience in common. It wasn't a theoretical matching of, oh, here's somatic psychology and here's expressive arts therapy. What do they have in common? Let's look at the, shared theoretical underpinnings and the conceptual basis. It was both of these experiences make me feel the same way in my body. And so it was, for me, a process of growing up, dancing and drawing and writing poetry that very much connected to my sense of who I was in my body. That these experiences with art made me feel alive in my body. And that in doing body-oriented work, either through my own exploration or by, engaging in a body-oriented psychotherapy session or a body-oriented, movement-oriented practice, that what happened for me that really elicited the material that I wanted to access was not just checking in with my body on a sensory level, but allowing my body to give me images or words or sounds that had a very artistic, very poetic quality to them. That my body didn't speak in literal language. It spoke in poetry.
Yeah.
And that by listening to my body as a producer of poetry, by listening with those ears, the ears of a poet, I was much better able to understand and connect to my embodied experience than when I tried to listen very literally. Like there's a little, small contraction in my psoas. That didn't do it for me.
Yeah.
But when I allowed an image to emerge from that tight place in my body, then I got it. That I could understand, that I could relate to, that I could work with. So I learned to work with myself in that way, and by extension, when I sought out psychotherapy training opportunities, I naturally gravitated to those modalities and approaches that were both body-centered and arts-focused. There aren't many of them that integrate the two of them really well, but there are some, and when there weren't, I chose separate ones and I put them together myself. And that was how I found myself best able to work with clients, was to find the poetry in the exploration of their body that we were engaged in.
Yeah. So that finding the poetry in the exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And you said a lot of very beautiful things, and I'm going to try and separate a few strands. But
sure.
One thing is that in your own experience, there's something that was very powerful to notice, that actually the experience was very similar when
Yes.
when you are very connected to your body, and when you're in a creative artistic mode. And so we're
Yes.
not talking about something of putting together separate things, but actually it starts from that profound realization that your experience is similar. And coming from there is the other insight, is to notice that when you actually listen to the language of your body, you get more understanding and more connection and more communication when you listen in a poetic mode than when you listen in a literal mode.
Yes.
Yeah. So that poetic body is really, in a way, relational about how you want to be with yourself, in a sense that there's more coming up when you are both mindful, connected to the body, and in a poetic mode.
That's exactly it. That for me, understanding and supporting myself to allow my relationship to my body to be one that's artful has been both really illuminating and has shifted my understanding of the forms that knowledge can take. Because I think in this culture we're very socialized to think of knowledge as always being literal and factual, and to be skeptical of metaphor, that somehow metaphor and symbol and creativity is a little messy, it's a little sloppy, it's not precise and accurate. And what I found, both in my own explorations with myself and in the clinical work that I've done with clients, is that the creative and the poetic and the metaphoric not only can very precisely capture the meaning of something that's going on in the body, in the self, that it not only captures it, it also elicits more. That the creative process is a process that allows me to draw on many, many aspects of experience and integrate them and synthesize them and express them without losing richness or depth, or, I think, actually in the long run, accuracy. I just think it's a different way of understanding what we usually think of to be accurate information.
Yeah. So when I'm hearing you, what I hear is a sense that, in a way, instead of the usual form of knowledge, which is capturing things in language that is finite and in a way rigid, You're entering into a process, and there is something of this process itself which is allowing, in a way, more understanding of what happens than rigid forms.
More inclusive, and not only more inclusive in terms of what those processes can express and communicate, but what those forms can evoke in others. So not only can I gather a lot of who I am and touch on many layers of experience when I write a poem, when someone reads that poem or hears me recite it, it's not just a communication of my literal experience. It allows them to touch in and also gather for themselves what their analogous experiences have been.
So in a way, it's a transmission of experience. It's kind of allowing to recreate something or to transmit a similar experience as opposed to simply describing.
Yes, so that what the person who hears the poem gets is not just a transmission of my experience, but an elicitation of theirs.
Yeah, an elicitation of theirs. So they're in process as well. It's not something that's finite, but something that continues and is an active process.
Absolutely. And it has a ripple effect.
So as we're talking about these are terms that I would assume resonate very deeply for Laury.
Yes, the terms do, but also as I was listening to Ray, as I was listening to you share your experience, describing you in your body and how it opens into image or metaphor or words or poetry, I was just like, oh yes, that's what happens with me. That's my whole story. And I felt the word resonance came to me in just what you were describing about sharing a poem, but also when you were speaking, it's like, yes, all of that resonates very deeply with me, and was kind of what I was saying in the beginning of how I got to combine, focusing is my practice with the expressive arts. So I would like to, I'd like to add that in addition to focusing, I have a background also in, other body-oriented psychotherapies and having worked, in different ways for a long time. So although I emphasize focusing because it's sort of the thing I've been cultivating for 30 years, I have the awareness of the other somatic approaches. So I would like to add, Serge, if that seems right, as a follow-up, kind of take what Ray said and how it combines with what my sense is and illustrate actually a client. This would be a nice balance with the personal.
Great.
Yeah?
Great.
Yeah. So what comes to me is that, we live in our body, and it's true that many of us have become separated from being in the experience of our bodies, and there's a lot of movement towards getting to know our bodies and finding many ways to come into the body. And, when I learned focusing, one of the things that I really liked about it is Jean Jen said, that this is a natural process of listening inside to the body and accessing what's there. And it's just about learning a way to be friendly to our experience to come into it. And he also said that creative people have probably always known this. And so what I mean is not just focusing, but about being in the body. He said creative people have always known this, but what's new and different, with focusing, or I think with any of the somatic approaches, are the steps that can help people get there. So in my work, one of the things that I love so much with focusing is this simplicity of when I bring attention down inside to my body, or guide a client to come down inside to their body. In focusing, we say, is there a word or a phrase, an image, a gesture, or a sound that matches or acts like a handle for that inner felt sense? And then there's a waiting. We kind of pause and wait for something to come. And, in different moments, it might be a word or a phrase or an image, a gesture, or a sound. And for me, in the work of connecting, focusing, or somatics with the expressive arts, it was so natural, because the word or phrase easily becomes a poem or creative writing. The image easily becomes a visual art expression. The gesture becomes a movement or a dance. And the sound becomes music or voice. And so both processes are so natural, and that's why when Ray was just talking and she was describing, being in the body and how the image comes and all of that, it's just natural. So this integration, this crossing of focusing and expressive arts is just, they are just together. There's nothing separate about it.
Yeah, what you're describing is something where as you try to find if there is a word or an image or a movement that corresponds to this felt sense, as you're in that waiting moment, in a way there is that poetic process, that artistic creative process that comes up, because you're not in a literal mode of trying to put things in category, but you're literally waiting, listening for the body to express itself in a poetic mode, as Ray was saying.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the process that happens when you're an artist or you're a musician and you're kind of in the midst of creating something and you don't yet know what it's going to be, or what color is really the right color, or what balance is the right balance. And there's kind of a waiting and a listening in the body, and that's a little glimpse into how the somatic and the creative process are all like in there together.
And so, what's happening is, even if we're not doing specifically something that's labeled as art therapy, we are very much in a creative process as a therapist and as a client. And that's a very different mode than being a doctor or being in the process of fixing people or repairing something that's wrong or talking about pathology. But there is an inherent quality of paying attention to the creative ability of the two people in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell my students all the time that doing therapy is a creative process, because we don't know moment to moment what is going to happen. We don't know what the client is going to say. And then it requires us, listening, and it's completely a creative process. So would it be okay if I share a little glimpse with the client?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so this was a client I was working with for a while, and sometimes I begin, just with I call it a focusing check-in, to just take a moment to go inside the body and, relax and just to notice how am I in this moment? And so, the space becomes quiet, and we sit and wait, allowing the client to check inside their body. So the client shared after a while, that she had a burning sensation in her heart and her chest. And so I said that, back to her. And then I asked her if there was a word or a phrase or an image, a gesture, a sound that matched that. And she got the image of a torn heart, is what she said. So then I invited her to draw the torn heart. So she used oil pastels and made this heart that was kind of bluish and purplish. And then she wrote on one side of the paper underneath it, she wrote, bruised heart. And then on the other side, will it fall apart? Mm. And so for me, this is some of the poetry of the body. Like the image came, and then the words just naturally came. And so then after she shared about that and we, I was listening to her, then I invited her to go back inside and to sit down, to imagine sitting down next to that bruised heart. And to just in a gentle way to ask it, what does it need? And then she took a little while, and then she opened her eyes and she said, yep, I got it. And she added around the bruised heart these strong hands that she colored in orange color and then put this yellow light around the heart. And then she said that as she was with that, that there was this warmth came into the heart, into her chest. And it began to soften. And it soothed the bruised heart. And she said a sense of faith emerged. And then she wrote underneath, she wrote strong hands holding it together. Mm. And so it's like what Ray was saying about how as you keep company in the body and as you open to the messages that the body brings forth that speaks in this poetic language through image, through color, through brief words, the body has its way of healing itself and bringing forth, what it needs for healing. And, then there's a way of like Ray was saying about accessing the meaning. I mean, then, there's more things that could come from that, which we're not going to go into now because we have this is a short conversation. But just to see how the body speaks and intersects with creativity in such a natural way.
Yeah. So that's a very beautiful example of actually, that poetic interaction, that poetic understanding, and a sense of also how it's not something where poetic or artistic is divorced from reality or from sensation, but actually it is very much fed by that very real contact with awareness of the body.
Right, exactly.
And what's remarkable to me about your example, Laury, is that if one had attempted to explore those issues through literal narrative, tell me what's happening in your life right now.
Mm-hmm.
That although the client may have been able to say, well, I'm going through a really difficult time with my partner and we're fighting a lot and I feel, as though we're on really shaky ground. You could get a whole story that might map onto that experience of torn heart. And you might even be able to think your way through what a good possible solution for that difficult relational experience might be. Mm-hmm. But what I don't think you'd have is the actual experience of change.
Right.
That just talking through the narrative doesn't allow the insight, if there is one, to seep into a person's experience. Whereas with your client, she actually felt her heart soften.
Right.
She felt strengthened. Change was already occurring without there needing to be some externally manifested series of tasks to repair that relationship. That she could go back to, I'm imagining, this relationship that's causing the heartbreak. She could go back to that situation in her life with resources that she could feel.
Yes.
And I don't think that happens when you take apart people's life problems in a literal way.
Yeah.
And try to solve them from there.
There's something very powerful, Ray, in your describing this, in saying that when you are in a process of embodied poetry, you are already in the process of change.
Yes.
And so you're already partly there. And that's something that feels like a very, very, very powerful way to describe this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then there's an added thing about what the expressive art part does to continue it, because it's a wonderful dance between being in and hearing the body's messages and sensations and how the answer comes naturally from within, from the client or in ourselves. And then, especially with the visual art, because I'm seeing the picture that she drew, she then has that as the reminder. And in looking at it, it mirrors back or reflects back the somatic knowing and the somatic experience, and continues the process. It continues even further. So it's just also powerful.
Right. So your client doesn't have to remember the issue. She doesn't have to remember the story in order to take it out into her life and to do something about it. She can look at the drawing, and the drawing not only reminds her, it evokes that experience.
Right.
So it's alive for her. Rather than something like, oh yeah, right, what am I supposed to do to solve that problem? What was that again? Which I think is it's just a very different way of approaching psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's true because you do, like movement and just movement or psychodrama or music. It's when you add that added sensory dimension to the, inner somatic attending. It just, the being able to carry it forward, or what you remember, is just on another level.
Yeah.
So, Ray, as you were talking about this, there was a sense that, in a way, it's, while any specific modality, such as painting, drawing, dancing, is obviously something that's going to help the process this way, I think you were also talking about the fact that being in a certain state, finding that kind of, embodied poetry state, independently of a specific, creative, expressive modality, is also that part of poetic healing.
Yes. And I think that there are a couple of things going on in that experience. One is that we're working with an experience of who we are on a level that's sort of inherently going to provide an experience of change. In the same way that Laury described a process where she guided her client to a step where the question was asked, what does this broken heart need? And the answer comes out, rather than having to stop and figure it out cognitively. That working in this particular way sort of allows us to tap into what what Jean Gendlin would call a natural process, that we as human beings already know how to do this, and that the seeds of our needed transformation are already within us. I think it does that. But I think the other thing that it begins to do over time is to heal a really significant historic rift between our embodied experience and our conceptual ideas about who we are as human beings. That we're, at this point in time, really inheriting a legacy that's divided mind and body in ways that don't serve us. And that going back to the body, back to sensation, back to the creative, back to the artistic, and understanding ourselves through those ways of being actually begins to strengthen our confidence that those elements of ourselves are important and valuable and are as much a part of who we are and how we understand ourselves as the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are.
Yeah, so in other words, to not just think of them as means to an end or tools for a cure, but
yes.
A way, a practice in which we inhabit a part of us that we don't live as much in, and that as we practice it more, we expand our sense of self in a way that helps us grow overall.
Yes, that we learn not just a strategy for helping ourselves change, but we learn a new way of being in the world.
So that sounds like a beautiful way to conclude. I want to just double check if this would be, with both of you, if this might be a good place to, in a way, bookmark this conversation, or if you would want to add something else.
It feels good to me.
For our next conversation, Serge, I would love to spend some more time talking about how the creative process and implicit knowing can inform our research and our research methodologies.
Beautiful.
Because I think that that's a territory that still suffers from a fairly limited paradigm of what we understand knowledge to be. And I think that that's one of the contributions that somatic psychotherapists and expressive arts therapists can make to the field of clinical psychology research, is to support that there's more than one way of knowing something, and that it is possible to do sound, rigorous, coherent research into those territories and bring them forth in meaningful ways.
This recording is part of the podcast at relationalimplicit.com.
Conversation, Serge, I would love to spend some more time talking about how the creative process and implicit knowing can inform our research and our research methodologies.
Beautiful.
Because I think that that's a territory that still suffers from a fairly limited paradigm of what we understand knowledge to be. And I think that that's one of the contributions that somatic psychotherapists and expressive arts therapists can make to the field of clinical psychology research, is to support that there's more than one way of knowing something, and that it is possible to do sound, rigorous, coherent research into those territories and bring them forth in meaningful ways.
This recording is part of the Somatic Mindfulness and Relational Psychotherapy podcast. See the website relationalimplicit.com.